Okay,
All right. Looks like it's going.
great. So welcome to Pressure Fermentation. You've already heard Marcelo and Patrick talk about this, and I know there's been discussions in the Facebook group as well, and it's gone back and forth a little bit, and a lot of it. This is still new to me, so I know that people ask me questions of that, and ask for information, and a lot of this is still new. Like I said, how I learned to stop worrying. I love my spunding valve, right? Uh, let's see if I can move this thing. Oh, hold on a second. Let's see if I can. Will this go? I don't know. What's going on here? Let's see. Oh, I see. Oh, that's what you're going to be, eh? All right. There we go. Okay, now I've got it, sort of thing. So what's it all about? Well, I'm going to do a quick presentation. I'm going to do just have a discussion here about do a little personal introduction and a disclaimer, talk about how this came to be, some research, and some keys to the process. Spunding or spunding, I think is the right pronunciation. Benefits and not so benefits, benefits and detriments, I guess, right? So the valve and other equipment, my process, and I'm strictly doing loggers. So I'll get to that in a second, and also just to sum up a little bit of a summary, and then we'll open it up for questions if there are any. But I think a lot of the questions can get answered as we go through, so we'll see. So disclaimer, I'm not an expert, right? Like I said, this is still new to me. Um, I only started getting interested in this a bit last year, and it's really I'll go through with it in probably the next slide or so. But I only started getting interested in last year. I've done a number of loggers this way during late 2019 and all the way to this past weekend. But I've never done any ales this way. The way I look at ales, being kind of like, well, they ferment fast enough, and I'm happy with what goes on with them, so I'm not going to bother with doing that. But as you've heard with Patrick, he's fermented IPAs and that type of stuff. He's very happy with it, and I think Andrew McCready as well, who's on the call, yeah, he's also done this. So as we go through this, with ales and that type of stuff, I might, throw it out to Andrew or Patrick, and obviously Marcelo's got experience with it as well, right? I'm still learning, and I garner information from fellow GTA Brew members and pro brewers and fellow homebrewers online. So I mean, I'll explain a little bit more about that. Obviously, fellow GTA brewers, GTA Brews members, there's a lot of other people who are doing this. They just don't always tell you that they're doing it, or they're not always explaining it. So it's always good to ask the question and just say, hey, has anybody, I mean, I know this happens in the Facebook group a lot and sometimes in the social chat. It's a little bit harder if you're not part of those groups to ask questions. But that's okay. If you're at a meeting, whether it's virtual like this or in person, it's always good to ask a question. There's never a bad question, right? Ask away. There's always people willing to help, right? Which is a good thing. And that's the only way I learned, right? So, yeah. And remember, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So the way I do it doesn't mean like, this is it. This is the be all and end all. No, I mean, there's different ways of doing it. Like there's always opportunity to learn too, right? So the quest for loggers. You got to be a certain age to know the reference there, right? So how did this start? Well, late last year, after Brew Slam, I was kind of burnt out from beer, right? So yeah, if any of you ever get an opportunity in the future, once we are able to do Brew Slam again, right, to volunteer and to help out at Brew Slam, it's really a good experience. But there's so much beer that goes around, and there's so much information on beer, and that if you're volunteering, I found I got kind of burnt out and I wasn't excited anymore about brewing. And I really was kind of like, you know, no big deal, right? Like my ales were okay. They weren't great. They were like, right? And I was like, lagers are right? But after Brew Slam, I started thinking, you know what? I would like to do some lagers. And what would it be like? How to do them really well? Because I had done a couple, but they were always like, meh. So I wanted a way to ferment the lagers without having to deal with temperature control. I have temperature control here. I've got a couple of the Danby 4.4 cubic foot squat fridges. They're small fridges. They're great. They fit my fermenters fine. I can drop the temperature down, etc. But I also know that through brewing, that come this time of year, August, like July, August, it's hard to get the groundwater is warmer. So when you're trying to chill your wort, there's only two ways. There's only one of two ways to do it. Either you're going to have to keep running this, cold, but not cold enough water through a chiller to get your wort cool, or you're going to have to go with okay, I've chilled my wort enough, I'm going to toss it in the fermentation chamber and chill it some more until I pitch my yeast. But in the case where all you've got is cold water and you don't have a fermentation chamber, well, what do you do if you want to do a lager, right? Well, there's you could try using Kvike and do a lager, right? Or you could go ahead and do it this way, I guess, under pressure, right? So I wanted, and the beauty of it is that I wanted lagers faster, right? Like, because you hear the stories about, then I got to put it aside for 3 weeks to lager, and then that's after 2 weeks of fermentation, and then maybe the next week once it carbs up. So you're waiting like in my case, I guess 6 to 8 weeks sometimes, right? Maybe longer, depending on who you are, right? So I wanted just a faster turnaround, and I wanted to experiment and reinvigorate brewing, right? Because I was burnt out. So I kind of wanted something that would kind of make me get the juices flowing again, right? So that's the reason why I was looking at this. So I started doing some research on it. And there's the quote: "If we knew what it was we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it?" Right? So that's Einstein's quote, right? So I started discussing this process because I started thinking about it. It really came about through Raj Lal and Clayton Hoy, right? I say mostly Clayton. That's because everybody blames Clayton, right? So, but really, it's like I was over at Raj's place and he had me try a Pilsner that he had done. And then he explained what he had done to get this Pilsner. And then he told me how quickly he had turned it around. I was like, wow, this is a decent Pilsner for that short of a time, right? And then I started talking to Clayton because I knew Clayton had done pressure fermentation. And we discussed it a little bit. And then, of course, I went and did some online research. I say valid sources, versus fake news, that type of stuff, right? But really, if you do some research on it and you do some searching on fermenting under pressure or fermenting lagers under pressure, there's a lot of good information. Videos specifically, there's a video out there from Brad Smith, who did an interview with John Blickman and Chris White from White Labs, and they discuss it and they go through their process. It's a very interesting discussion. There's also home brewers who have video channels, YouTube channels, like I've said about them before. Beer and Barbecue by Larry. The guy's he's a bit of a character, but he's interesting to listen to. And he also did like he called it like an 11-day lager or something like that, right? So it was I did a lot of the research, right? Mostly again about fermenting under pressure and this spunding valve creation, right? And then of course, eventually I did a brew day where I thought, okay, I've got all this stuff together. Let's see what happens. Let's really find out if this is this going to work, right? Uh, and uh, and I went from there, right? So let's see. Oh, yeah, key to the process, right? So, Spund, as they say, is I believe is the way the Germans pronounce it, right? And it means to bung, right? So, it's it's a valve, right? But basically, what it came about from was the Reinheitsgebot, right? Which really is the German purity law that everybody talks about, right? And they were like, there's only certain things you can add to beer. Beer can only be made from, like, I think at the time it was like three things. There's like yeast. No, not yeast. Sorry, pardon me. Water, malt, and hops. And then yeast came after, right? But definitely no external or additional CO2. It's not really under penalty of death. I just added that in because it sounded cool, right? And basically, they went through this and were able to, they say Spund, right? But they say German brewers developed ways to carbonate their beer via krausening and Spunding, right? And basically what the Spunding is it's like this image here is a image of I think it's a water pressure Spunding valve. And basically this thing here is actually the Spunding, is actually the valve, right? So it's got a water pressure. It's filled, these two tubes are filled with water, and they actually are filled to a certain level. And the pressure kind of goes out from the CO2 from the fermentation chamber, right? So that's an old way of doing this from like the 1800s, I think it was, right? And it is said that Spunding will create a different mouthfeel, right? Creamier to the beer due to the size of the bubbles created. And this is one of the things I talked about initially when I first had a discussion with Marcello about this. And I said, you know what? It's really interesting. You taste the beer and it tastes just different from like beer that you would force carb. And he said, aha, and the way Marcelo usually does, right? He said, aha, he goes, it's the tiny bubbles. And I think that's where that comes from. Like it actually, if once you do it, you'll see, and you go, it does have a different mouthfeel to it, right? Or at least I do. I find that, right? And there's benefits, of course, of Spunding, right? It suppresses the fusel alcohols and esters formed during fermentation, right? So what pressure does, fermenting under pressure, suppresses volatile compounds that form esters, right? So the whole idea of the Spunding valve is to set the valve at a certain pressure level and allow the pressure to build up in the fermentation chamber, right, to that level, and basically it maintains it during the fermentation, right? And it's a natural way of suppressing these fusels and esters, right? Also, there's less time to fully carbonate a batch of beer because what happens with is normally in most of our process that we do as homebrewers is we hook up a airlock or we hook up a blow-off valve to a fermenter, right? Whether it's a carboy or some type of fermenter that we're using, and basically the carbon dioxide that builds up from the process of the yeast converting the sugars to alcohol, that usually just blows out, right? What the Spunding valve does is it retains some of that carbon dioxide in the chamber itself, and it gets reabsorbed into the beer. So at the end of fermentation, if you were to take a sample of the beer, it is pretty much fully carbonated, right? And that means there's less CO2 that you have to add as a home brewer to actually have that beer ready for you to drink, right? I found, I mean, I'm sure others who have more experience than me, right? But I found that I still need to add some carbon dioxide to it after the fact, but the initial pour after fermentation is complete is like really miraculous, because it's like, wow, because you're getting head on the beer. And anyway, so that's exciting, right? There's less time to fully ferment a beer too, especially lagers, right? The lagers that I do, I have a set schedule, and touch wood, I've never had to vary from that schedule. So basically, I if I pitch my yeast on brew day, 8 days later, it's done fermenting, and on the ninth day, I'm usually transferring it to a keg, and then I can let it sit, clear, if I want to let it sit for like a day or two or whatever it is, and I can be drinking within, like, as Larry would say, like 11 days, right? So, and you lager beers at room temperature, right? So higher temperatures than your standard lager yeast, right? Most lager yeasts are usually looking at, like, I'm an old school guy, so I'm going to talk in Fahrenheit. Uh, I, I'm going to have a tough time converting back to Celsius, right? Even though I know what Celsius is. So most lager yeasts, I assume, are like in the 48 to like 55, 56 Fahrenheit range. And, all my lagers are done in this particular room here, which is like a basement. So like right now, I guess it's about, without the air conditioning on, probably about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 68, maybe 20 degrees Celsius, right? And I do have a batch sitting over there that's fermenting like right now, right? And it's no problems so far, right? So there is bad stuff that happens too, of course. The cons are, while you're suppressing esters formed during fermentation, right? Because pressure suppresses volatile compounds that form esters, but sometimes you might want those esters, right? And that's something that I would actually like to hear from, the guys who do the fermentation of ales, etc. So whether it's Patrick or Marcelo or Andrew, right? Have you guys done, like, Patrick? I'll ask you the question, like, you did your IPA? Did you find that did you want esters in that IPA, and did you get any, even though you fermented under pressure?
I didn't get any, but my intent was to try and get none at all. That was the point of it. I really wanted I threw a ton of Galaxy in it for dry hop, and I wanted the Galaxy to shine. So, again, it was probably the cleanest batch of SO4 that I've ever had, because I enjoy the SO4 esters that come through, and they are subtle, but more back to those English styles. But I just wanted something clean. It was what I had in the fridge at the time, and it excelled. It was you can't tell what it was fermented with.
Mm. Andrew, I don't know if I think you're still on, right? So did you ferment anything there where you wanted esters and you did this under pressure and you still got them, or?
Yeah, when I want the esters, I tend to not start under pressure. I start with a blow off for the first day or two, and then I spun and I creep up to 5 psi and then slowly up to 15 over a few days. So
Interesting. Okay.
So the main benefit I'm getting from the under pressure is because I ferment in kegs, it lets me easily pull samples with the Cobra tap. It also lets me be at a pressure when I cold crash, so I stay at positive pressure even with the temperature drop. And
all right, cool.
It does also, if you're doing ales, it does let you ferment at a higher temperature than you would otherwise if you're in a situation where you don't have temperature control. So like if you would normally ferment at 20 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Celsius, you could creep that up closer to like 24, 25 and be at
wow.
like 5 psi, and you're going to get 10 psi, and you're going to get closer to the esters you would get at the colder temperature.
Oh, that's cool.
Did you try my ESB I gave you, David?
I did. I had it the other night, and it was really tasty.
So that was under pressure, and I feel like I still got the esters that I wanted from that ESB yeast on that one.
I would say you did. Yeah, I would say you did, because it did taste very English, and it was nice, rich flavor, had a beautiful color to it. So definitely, I
So
didn't
yeah,
know that was under pressure. Well
so
done.
that was the process I did there, where I started with no pressure, and after a day or so, I started creeping it up slowly.
Cool, cool.
Whereas with my lagers,
Andrew,
I do a process more similar to you, where I start with it at 15 psi. Like I put CO2 into the keg when I start, so I start right off the get go at 15.
Right. I know, Daryl. I know you were going to ask something, so I saw you speak up there.
can I actually ask Andrew a question? When you start your ales, you said you start them with like no pressure. Do you just like seal the keg and just like leave it just with you don't put any head pressure on it at all, like to
No,
seat the O-ring, anything?
I put a just a blow off on it into like a thing of star sand. Blow off.
Okay.
And then I just replace that with the spunding valve after a little bit.
Yeah. So with respect to what Andrew's talking about, for those who are interested in the spunding valve, like basically what that spunding valve does is it's like a pressure release valve. So basically it'll allow you to adjust the pressure that's in the fermentation vessel, whether it's a keg or an all-rounder like Patrick is using, or something like that, where it'll allow you to adjust the pressure to a certain psi, and it'll usually hold it there pretty well during fermentation or even after, right? And then so it's different than just attaching, like what Andrew said, attaching a blow-off tube, for example, so to a keg, where that's not going to hold any pressure because it's free to just kind of keep going out, right? So so yeah, speaking of which, paying attention to the valve. This is something that I do with the lagers, because what happens is, with my process, which I'll get into in just a little bit, is I cap that vessel, the fermentation vessel, immediately, once I pitch my yeast. So immediately once I pitch my yeast, a cap goes on the fermentation vessel, which is a squat keg, and I top it up with a jolt of CO2 to 15 psi, and I leave it there with the spunding valve on it, right? But what eventually happens is, of course, when you pitch your yeast in there, the yeast doesn't immediately just go like this and just raise it up. It takes a few hours to get going. And sure enough, over time, sometimes that little needle on the spunding valve on the gauge can raise yourself well beyond the 15 psi that you intended. Some people start it with no pressure at all, no added pressure, and just let it build up. Others, myself, for example, I will like to just add it enough just to get it to maybe 14 or 13 psi, and then let it go from there. So, so paying attention to the valve, that's kind of important, especially on the next day, like after 24 hours or 12 to, I guess maybe you could say maybe 12 to 18, but probably within 24 hours, you're okay. Just check the valve to make sure that it's not like, racking into like 45 psi or something like that, right? Yeast health is another thing about spunding, right? And this is where initially I mentioned that I talked to pro brewers about this. One of the things I mentioned when I was really excited about this, and I still am, right? But one of the things that really got me going was, I remember talking to Jeff Manal at Muddy York, and I was explaining, I said, wow, you know what? I did a German Pils, and it actually tastes good. And, it's like, it's clear, and it only took me like 11 days. Like, it took me like 9 days to finish fermentation. And he's like, come on. He's like, he goes, did you cap your fermenter? And, I said, oh yeah, I did. He goes, doesn't that kill the yeast though? Like, yeah, this is something I've heard, right? The yeast don't like pressure, right? And it inhibits the growth. And in extreme cases, it can kill the yeast, right? But, in the pressure that I'm dealing with, and I don't know about anybody else, in talking with Clayton, Clayton would normally say that he would only have gone up to like 8 or 10 psi. And talking with Raj, when Raj introduced me to this, Raj said 15 psi. I looked up some information online. Most people say 15 psi. That's okay, right? But Jeff was talking. He says, no. He goes, I've heard of people doing this, and normally they would do it as Andrew had suggested. They started off, and then after the third or fourth day of fermentation, they'd cap it. They'd cap their fermenter, and then, because the concern is yeast health. As homebrewers, I don't think we're as concerned about yeast health per se, from the aspect of trying to reuse the yeast, right? But also the sizes that we're using at 15 psi, 5-gallon batches, maybe 10-gallon batches, it's not going to do anything, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, to the yeast. I'm not a yeast scientist. Maybe this is something that we could ask Nate or such from Escarpment. But basically, when I was talking to Jeff about this, and he came back to me and he said, you know what? Now that I think about it, some of those places that actually use this method that are professional brewing have 30 hectoliter tanks. The pressure that's on the yeast from the volume of liquid is more than 15 psi, and those yeasts still have no issue. So so there is a concern there from the yeast health perspective. I've never had an issue with all the yeasts I've used for lagers, and I've used a lot of different yeasts. I've used Mexican lager yeast from Escarpment. I've used similar yeast, the K Bueno, which is from Imperial. I've used WLP 800, which is the Pilsner Urquell yeast. It's a strain D, I think it is. And it turns out really nicely. 3470, as Patrick had suggested earlier, is a great yeast. It really, it just drops out, just drops clear. And that's a dry yeast. I've also used Munich yeast for a dunkel, which is had no issues as well, right? So but I'm putting it out there because that's sort of a concern with respect to pressure, and also, you need a fermenter obviously that can handle the pressure, right? So I know this sort of came up in the Facebook chat, not Facebook chat, but on the Facebook group earlier today regarding fermenting a full 5-gallon batch in a 5-gallon fermenter, right? And you need to have room. You need headspace. And definitely more so if you're going to cap the fermenter with a spunding valve, because pressure is going to build up. A lot of the carboys, I don't believe they're pressure rated. A lot of the Fermonster wide mouth fermenters, they're not pressure rated. The new all-rounder is pressure rated. A lot of your standard corny kegs obviously are pressure rated, and of course Sankey kegs are pressure rated too. And that's currently what I use. I only have one of these fermenters because all I'm doing is lagers in it, and it's a converted old 30-liter Unibrew Sankey keg by a People's Pint, right? And it works fine, right? So sorry, moving along. I'm probably wasting people's time here. So the valve. Okay, so what to consider with the valve? Well, you can do it yourself. There are many videos online, and that's what I did. I did a DIY, right? You can order stuff through Amazon, find some cheap parts from Home Depot as well, and away you go. You're ready to go. So you can keep your cost to very minimal, or you could spend a lot of money on things like this SS Brewtech spunding valve, tri-clamp spunding valve, which is like $200 plus, right? So the gauge scale item here, well, if you look at this picture here in the lower right-hand corner you'll see that this gauge goes from 0 to 60 psi. 60 psi is pretty significant, right? So I'm aiming for 15 psi. So I found a gauge that'll go from 0 to 30. And that way I know that if it's here, right in the middle, I'm all good because it's 15, right? If it's way over here, I probably got to adjust my valve a bit, right? Also, tube or not tube. So there are Spunning valves out there that have absolutely no clear tube, like this one here in the lower right-hand corner, right? I don't have one because the way I built it was based on this one here. So I just had a tube, and I guess one of the benefits of having the tube is when you have a situation where, for example, you've decided, oh, you know what? Oh, sure, let's pour all the wort in there, and you leave like a little bit of headspace, and then the fermentation goes on, and then you wake up the next morning and you see there's a bunch of crud going up through your gas disconnect into this tube. If the tube isn't there, it's going right into the Spunning valve. Right, and I'm assuming it could probably ruin the Spunning valve, right? So having the tube is just a little bit of a, I don't know, safety measure, I guess, for myself, right? And all this is the standard clear tubing that you can get from, Toronto Brewing or, Homebrew Beer Academy, etc. Right? Other equipment. So yeah, I mentioned the fermentation vessel. It needs to be able to withstand the pressure, right? And also must be big enough. So, like I said before, if you're going to do, in my situation, I always think I want a full 19 liters worth of beer going into my corny keg. I don't want to have to go through all this hassle not to have like a full corny keg of beer. So I made sure that the keg I'm using, which looks like this one here, the squat keg, the 30 liter, it has enough space to do that, but also has enough to ferment enough beer. And because I can't see it, I'm going to assume, I make assumptions based on what I've done already, that I'm leaving X amount in the bottom of this. And that could be due to yeast cake. If there's a lot of hops and I've dropped a lot of hops in there, or through the process, like, but for most of the part, it's the yeast cake that I'm concerned about, right? There's a 58 liter that you can get as well. So if you find, like, these are Sankey kegs, removing the actual spear that's in the Sankey keg to make this into a fermentation vessel is not difficult. Just do some searching online, and you'll find, it's really simple. All you need is like a screwdriver. You just got to be careful, because most of these kegs that you might get probably already have CO2 in them. And if you're looking over when you're trying to remove that spear, right? So just be wary of that. Not difficult to do though. Here is the recent entry called the All Rounder, right? And it's a clear fermenter that's actually pressure rated. I think it's 2 bars, so that's like 30 psi. I think you guys
2.5
sorry,
bars.
there you go, 2.5 bars, right? So that would mean what, like 30, like 37, 38, maybe. I guess they call it 40, maybe
40 and 40 and change.
Yeah, 40 and change, right? And so you're pretty much, if you're only aiming to ferment at like 15 or even less, you should be okay with this, right? And it's very inexpensive too. I could tell you the squat keg I got was used and it was like $15, right? But that means I also had to add things on top of it to make it into a ball lock keg, right? And that thing I had to add cost me about, I guess, $40 at the time, right? So, $55, right, to get a stainless steel fermenter versus, I think these are $69 right now, give or take, right? So, depending on what you're looking for, right? These are obviously you can get this brand new, and that's it. These you kind of have to look for, right? Also, you need, or you should, you don't have to, right? But you could have a floating dip tube. It's not a must-have, but it helps avoid sucking up too much of the yeast cake and sediment. Because if you're looking at things like this, like kegs, or if you're going to ferment in, for example, in a corny keg, you guys all know that the liquid out tube goes right to the bottom, right? So there's a couple options there. You can cut off a little bit of your liquid out tube, right? So you can leave a little bit of a space so that it's not sucking up some of the sediment from the yeast cake, or you opt for things like this thing here, which is a floating dip tube. It's very handy. I didn't think it would work initially, but it does, right? And well worth the investment, because I just drop it into my squat keg as I cap it, and away it goes, right? I mean, again, I'm just doing loggers. I'm not doing it's. There's benefits here with, I can see with the Firmzilla, let's say Firmzilla, sorry, pardon me, the all-rounder, because there's things that I can't do, or I guess not can't, but I just won't do in the squat keg or a regular Senki keg, which is like dry hopping, for example, right? You know, I'm doing loggers, I'm okay with that, right? But if you're doing ales and you want to dry hop, it looks like this makes it a lot easier, right? So, so anyway, quickly, the process: brewing the beer, standard stuff, mash in, boil, right? But when it comes to cooling, depending on where in your space you're going to be fermenting, you just cool to that room temperature, right? So normally, you know, you used to stress, or at least I used to stress about, you know, getting my beer as cold as possible. And now it's like, okay, well, 68 Fahrenheit, like 20 degrees Celsius, that's good enough, right? And then you pitch the yeast at the same room temperature where you're going to be fermenting, right? Again, like 20 Celsius, yeah, that's good. And then cap the fermenter. Like I said, some folks don't, right? But I live dangerously, right? So, a lot of people do and don't, depending on what they're fermenting, right? As Andrew had mentioned earlier, with his ales, if he wants those esters and that, he doesn't cap. But for his lagers, he just does the same thing, just a cap, right? And attach the Spunding valve, right? And you set it to the pressure that you need it at. And I say set I say air quotes, because each valve is going to be a little bit different. So the best way to get that valve sort of, I want to say, calibrated, is to attach it to a corny keg where you've got your CO2 and you've plugged on your CO2 in, and you've set your valve, your regulator valve, to like 15 psi, and you let it fill up until you stop hearing the that we always hear, right? And then basically take that off, put your Spunding valve on, and just adjust it and leave it sitting there for about an hour or two, just to see where it's going, right? And usually it's fairly good, right? Like I think today is like Tuesday. I started this on Saturday, so it's about 3.5 days into fermentation, and I think it's sitting at around 14 psi right now. It did get up there as high as like 26, 27 after the first day, and I had to just slowly dial it down, let it blow off some air, right? Or some CO2. I say air. Yeah, I usually top up with the CO2 to bring the fermenter to the pressure I prefer. But you can also just allow it to build up on its own, because it will build up, right? Keep an eye on the valve, as I said earlier. Most of the DIY valves need some adjustment. I know a lot of people who've made, or some of the guys who've made their own, have said that they would prefer to buy moving forward. I'm happy with what I've done. Seems to work fine. I don't have any issues. The beer tastes good, so I'm not going to change until it, I guess, breaks or something happens, right? And after about the 8th day, draw a sample. Like I think somebody said they use a Cobra tap. I call it a picnic tap, right? It's basically just like liquid out and a little squeeze tap with a hose between it, right? You can get them for like $15 or $20. You just attach that to the liquid outpost, and you'll be surprised. You'll be number one. I think the first thing you go is like, wow, there's a lot of foam, right? Well, of course, because it's been building up. But after you get past that, you'll realize, hey, this is carbonated, right? So you can draw a sample, and the idea there is you want to taste it, but the whole concept is, let's see what the reading is to see if it's close to being done, and usually it is, right? But you got to let it degas, and by that I mean you just got to let it sit there. For me, I still use a hydrometer and a graduated cylinder. I know some people are using with the calculators. They're using their what do you call it? My mind is drawing a blank here. You hold it up to the light, you can see the gravity and the bricks. Jeez.
Refractometer.
There you go. Thank you. Refractometer, right? Thank you. So, I know some people are using that. I still do it old school with the hydrometer and the graduated cylinder, right? And just let it sit there and get your reading off it. And then I keg the beer basically on the 9th day, right? Usually the 8th day, it's done. I have not come across any lagers with any yeast that is not complete by day 8, right? If you're expecting to go, it usually doesn't, but by day 8 it's done, right? You can draw a sample earlier, right? But I guarantee you, day 8, done, right? Day 9, in the keg, right? So there's pros and cons to doing this. Pros: suppression of fusible alcohols and esters, faster turnaround, natural carbonation, no real temperature control required. Cons: well, you need to get a fermenter that can handle the pressure. There is yeast health to consider, right? And suppression of esters it can be a con depending on if you're looking to suppress esters, right? But there's ways around that, as we heard from Andrew, right? Valves, they're not difficult to create, right? But can be a little bit expensive if you want to purchase them, but that's up to you guys how you want to do it. The all-rounder, I don't know, unitanks, they're expensive. The all-rounder's inexpensive, and you can do this. Unitanks are very expensive, but they're stainless and they look nice, so and I think this is great for lagers. I mean, you can literally be, if you really, really want to, you can literally be drinking the lager on day 11, right? And that is something always that I found to be really, really exciting, right? And they taste clean too, right? I don't think, again, right? I've never had anything come across as being, coming out of this type of pressure fermentation, right? So I know there's been a lot of talk. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I am open for questions, and I'm sure Daryl and Andrew and Marcelo would be willing to chip in as well.
Yeah, just one quick comment. I did a ESB last week under pressure, and all my fermentations so far, because I want to test all the limitations and test all the process. When I started, I just cap it and let it rise. So probably that's the reason I got the sulfur in one of the fermentations. But under pressure, I mean, under no pressure, I got the sulfur as well for that particular yeast. So one day I'll figure out what happened there. But the ESB I did last week was amazing. It fermented in 5 days. And I want you guys to imagine something. When you are fermenting in a normal process, the CO2 happens within the beer and then it goes out to the blow-off, right? When you do under pressure, that CO2 stays in there. So if you have hop flavors or stuff that you think you're going to lose, a lot of it you're not going to lose because it's going to stay within that bubble, within the beer. And the taste of it, I cannot explain. You have to try the beer. It's amazing, amazing. I'm really happy with this process for ales, for lagers, and everything that I have done so far. Like I said, whatever profile you would have in taste without just with the normal fermentation, when you do with this, the taste is a lot better, and also the aromas. And now I'm just finishing this one. I did it on Friday, the pale ale, and I dry hopped this morning, and I can't wait. I'm gonna probably cold crash tomorrow because I want to see how the hops going down, and I'm gonna um, keg it as fast as I can.
Yeah, like really turning these things around quickly. I think it's exciting. I think that it allows you to do things where if you wanted to brew, you know, batch after batch to see what it was going to be like the next time, you can do that quickly and really adjust things on the I want almost on the fly, not quite on the fly, but adjust things from one batch to another very quickly. Whereas instead of waiting the standard, okay, I gotta wait like 2 weeks, like we all say we normally do, right? I mean, this is just another method of trying to get things going, I think, quicker, right? I mean, Denny and Drew in the last meeting had talked about, anything that'll speed up the process to them makes it more fun. Nobody likes spending a lot of time. I mean, we want to be patient, but if there's a chance that you can say, improve your beer by speeding up the process so that you don't have to wait as long to make the next batch to improve that batch, then it's a bonus. So I don't know if yeah, there's been a lot of talk. Oh my God, I missed a whole bunch of stuff in the chat, right? Yeah, there was talk like this, that the big changer seems to be that all rounder from Zilla, right? From Kegland down in Australia, and it seems like that, along with the duo-tight spunding valves, seem to be really very, very, very popular, right? Ed, I know that you've got one. I know that you've used it. It seems to be like it's a no-brainer, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I see Ed has his hand up too, so we can probably do both that and his question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to address, I think it was Ken, they asked, do you lose CO2 when dry hopping? Does it defeat the purpose? Yes, you do lose CO2, but it's just on the head, right? On the top that you have empty there. So empty it out, and to dry hop on this, I found out that you have to be pretty fast, because unless it's room temperature or there's any thermal shock in it, the CO2 will want to expand, and that is going to become a mess really fast. So I was watching some YouTube videos and I saw how people had trouble. So I just undid it, got my hops, close it, put pressure, it was all good. But I kind of got scared in that. But don't forget, you lose the CO2 from the top, but it's still, your beer is already fully loaded with CO2.
Sorry, Ed, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the all rounder. Yeah, I've been fermenting in the wide mouth, like the what is it, the Fermentosaurus and the big mouth bubbler, and I really like those. I mean, I used to do glass. I still have a glass carboy from like 25 years ago. But then I heard all kinds of horror stories about glass. So I switched to plastic, and the wide mouth, I can just get my hand in and I can, wipe out the gunk from the Kreuzen. So that's great. And this all rounder is basically one of those that is pressurizable. And because it's got a rounded bottom, it behaves a little bit like a conical. I mean, as much of a conical as the brew bucket, right? Because you've got that sort of bowl-shaped bottom, and you can tip it when you're transferring out. My question was, I did my first pressure brew this week. So I brewed it last Wednesday. It's either a dark dunkel or a light Schwarzbier. I'm not sure which, or maybe it's a Tmave Pivo. I don't know. I'll let you know when I taste it. But it's and I used the Augustiner, L17 Harvest, I guess, which is Augustiner.
Mm-hmm.
So I brewed it last Wednesday, kegged it today. So that's what, 6 days. The thing that I had not thought ahead to is the transfer. So I was transferring to the keg, and of course, the pressure in the keg is lower than the pressure in the fermenter. And so it foamed. And I originally, because I'd done a couple of brews, closed transfer, but not brewed under pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't CO2 in solution. And so I just opened that little pressure release valve on top of the keg, and it just, lets it transfer. This time I was doing that and I heard this, what's that bubbling? And it's foaming out of the pressure relief valve at the top. So what I ended up doing was just closing that until I saw some bubbles start to build up in the line. And then I just kind of just bled that valve a little bit to create a pressure difference. But
mm-hmm.
what do you do, or anyone else who's doing the brewing under pressure, to transfer so that it doesn't overfoam and degas while transferring?
I had that issue a lot when I first started doing the transfers as well, right? And I asked the question, and basically, I think I know Marcelo had responded to my question when I asked that in on the Facebook group, and basically it's about filling up your serving keg with some CO2 to get to that pressure, so it's an equal pressure, right? So there's not that differential. And then, like you said, as you open up a little bit off the pressure release valve, it starts flowing, and there's very little foam. The way Marcelo is doing it, as he showed at the beginning of the meeting with his setup, is probably the best way, right? I'm not there yet, so I'm kind of still doing it kind of like, oh, well, let me just attach this here and see if this works, right? But I have been able to get it where it's not foaming anymore, which is good. Because the bubbling that you hear, like I heard that too, and it's like, oh my God, what the hell? Like I'm getting air back in my beer here. I don't want this, right? So it's by about the second or third pressure fermentation, it won't be an issue, Ed, because you'll have your process down.
Routine of the process.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. But
I mean,
it does
I
happen.
can add something here too. So what I did for the IPA, obviously, I don't want to lose any of that, any of those aromatic compounds. So same idea, but I basically have the all-rounder up on the table and my keg on the floor. And what I'm doing from that point is I've got a jumper from the gas line on the keg to the gas line on the all-rounder. And what I'm doing, I'll burp the blow off on the keg just to get a little bit of less pressure after I pressurize them and equalize the pressure themselves. So once I'm hooking them up, they're exactly equalized, no problems there. I hook up the liquid lines, and then I burp the keg, which is at a lower level from the all-rounder. With burping it, you're obviously reducing the pressure in that end, and it's forcing the liquid up through the dip tube or through the float into the keg. And once I get enough of it flowing through, it just kept going. Now, it did take probably an hour to fully transfer from the all-rounder to the keg, but I didn't use a CO2 tank to blow anything further. I just let it continuously cycle through. and it filled the keg. I put it on a scale as well, so I know when I hit a full keg on it, but no problems there. No additional CO2 used. It just took time.
Yeah, that's a good point though, Patrick, with respect to the scale. I started doing that as well now because I never knew. Like I'm guessing, like I'm just thinking, oh well, it feels like it's full, right? But you measure it out and you kind of figure out, okay, well the tare weight is X, and then if it's a full keg, it's X plus whatever, right? And it is handy to have. And those scales, I mean, the scale I'm using is just you can get them from like Costco. It's a postal scale that can handle a lot of weight, right? Like 100, I think it's 130 or 150 pounds worth of weight, right? So it'll easily handle a keg, so full or empty. So.
Any other questions for David?
Hey, David. Max here again.
Hey, Max.
It sounds like you've got a bit of experience doing this and you're relatively new, so probably a lot of the stuff is fresh in your head. I mean, the spunding part, not the brewing part. But I'm wondering, would you be willing to put some resources together into like a spreadsheet, or the YouTube videos you had mentioned that were helpful to you? So somebody
for sure. Yeah. No two ways about it. They're really easy. It's funny because like I had asked the same question, Max, when I was starting to get interested in this, and that's like I said, Raj is not on the call, and Raj doesn't. He in-person meetings, he'll show up every now and then, but definitely he was the guy who said, "Yeah, buddy, here's a whole bunch of information," right? The interesting, if you really want to look at it from a sciencey perspective and hear some talk about it, the video by Brad Smith and with his interview with Chris White and was it Blickman he did the interview with? It was definitely Chris White. Yeah, Chris White and Blickman, I think it was. Right? That interview is very, very good. It's because they actually went through and did an actual experiment on doing these under pressure, the pressure fermentation. The other stuff I mentioned with respect to I like to shout out to him, even though I don't know who he is. Beer and Barbecue by Larry. There's something about, I don't know, there's something about that guy's videos that are kind of fun to watch, even though he's quirky, right? He's got these mannerisms.
It's very cathartic.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of neat because you feel like, oh, this guy's kind of like me, right? So but definitely his stuff was also very good and very easy to follow, and they're short. Like the thing on his spunding valve is like literally 2 minutes, right? And on his video channel, like on that YouTube video, he provides links to the stuff from Amazon, and whether it's Amazon.com or .ca, it doesn't matter. It's Amazon, so you can find it. But what you also can do is once you find this stuff out that he's ordering from Amazon, you can do your own searches. So, for example, like the brass, I think it was the brass barb that he suggested you use from Amazon. I found it like Toronto Brewing has them, right? And they're cheaper, right? So I bought it. I said, oh, what's the point of ordering from Amazon? I can go to Toronto Brewing and get it, right? The brass tea, well, geez, Home Depot's got it around the corner, right? And like I said, I decided to use a different gauge because I just wanted my gauge to read from 0 to 30 because I didn't expect to go over 30, even though a couple times I have gone over 30. So,
Awesome, man. If you could put together kind of a list of that stuff and check it up on the GTA Brews or
yeah, what I'll probably end up doing is I'll post it up on the I'll probably post it up on Facebook. Yeah, probably on the Facebook group. I mean, I don't know if it's necessary to do it on the website, but definitely it's this stuff. Like, and the funny thing is like I said, I'm not. I say this is new to me only because I've been doing it since like end of last year, beginning of this year. But there's been a lot of the people in the group who've been doing this for a lot longer, and it's sort of weird. It's almost like, and even in the homebrewing community, you kind of, nobody really says, I'm fermenting under pressure. Nobody comes out and says that. They people do their thing, and it's kind of like, wow, this is great, right? And then you ask about it, then eventually somebody will say, well, this is done under pressure, and you go like, oh, what's that? So it is neat. It is neat.
Cool, thanks.
No worries.
Yeah, I have a question as well. You said that like on day 7 or day 8, usually your lagers always come out clean. Have you tried one of those strains that it's not the Beer Garden or L17 Harvest, the Augustiner, but there's the other one from Munich, and that one needs like apparently a hefty diacetyl rest. Have you tried that one? Yeah.
That I think is Munich, and I think that's Y Yeast 2308. I think, right? Because that's the one I used for the Dunkel that I did. Right. I've done the Dunkel I used. It's a Y Yeast strain. And I know that it's not the same as L17 or the Augustine.
It's always one or the other. It's Beer Garden from Escarpment, then there's the other one. I am pretty sure Beer Garden is Harvest or Augustiner, but then there's the other one, Munich something. I'm not familiar with what it is. But that one, they say it needs a hefty, or typically needs a diacetyl rest. So I'm wondering, on day 8, do you find that that's still cleared up?
Part of me wants to say there's no issue with it, but the other part of me wants to say I might be blind to diacetyl. That's because I did do it. I did do the Dunkel with Y Yeast 2308, and it turned out I liked it. It was, as I think Ed was the one who said, it turned out being kind of like, well, it looks a little bit more like a Schwarzbier, and then it was like, but it tastes really good, so maybe it is a Dunkel, right? So but it did end up, I had no issues with it. It tasted really good to me. I think I had given a few out. So I hadn't heard anybody complain, but then again, I think the people I gave it to weren't BJCP judges. So
yeah, right? Like I'm not saying necessarily you would get it. I was just curious if you had experience with that. I mean, like ostensibly, you might assume that the roast in a Dunkel might mask it anyway. If you tried to do a Mexican lager with it instead of Quay Bueno and you had that on hand, maybe you would perceive it a little bit more, or maybe it wouldn't be there at all. But if someone ever comes across that and you find that even diacetyl rest is not necessary under pressure, I think that would be a big difference. Because I do W3470 usually at 20C without pressure, and I always find it's very clean, but W3470 is the workhorse strain. Alora, basically, even Lager Dave said that he finds that it's clean. They say, like, go ahead and use that 20C. But, with Quay Bueno, it's like, don't use that warm because everyone has proven that velocity experiment was significant, where it was noticeable, right? But a diacetyl rest is not a problem, so maybe that will be a huge difference for why you consider pressure fermentation, right? If you want to get past a diacetyl rest a lot faster.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point, right? Because I think that's one of those things that we kind of tend to look at a lot is the diacetyl rest, and I know that doing these lagers this way, I just go with, okay, 8 days should be done, right? And every time I've tasted it, it tastes good to me, right? I have provided other strains out to other people beyond the 2308, beyond the Munich strain. Things like the Czech pills I did, which is the WLP 800, and no issues there. 3470 is a no-brainer. I'm trying to think about. I keep looking around as though I'm going to see the yeast behind me because my yeast fridge is behind me. So, but a lot of them I've never had any issues with. So it would be interesting to find out, like, to actually provide, like, for example, like what I should really do is maybe, after this particular batch of Czech pills is done, and if I do another set of the Dunkel, right? Because I did buy recently the White Labs version of 2308, right? Because there is no imperial strain for it, right? So, and I can build that up and do that one because I like the Dunkel recipe. Just now I'm gonna claw back a little bit on that on some of the dark roast dark malts, right? So that it doesn't look like it's a Schwarzbier. And maybe I could trot it down at some point in the near future to Eric to let him try, and then he can give me feedback on whether there's diacetyl in it or not, because I know his ability to pick that up is probably way better than mine.
Yeah. Another thing to maybe consider is that with the benefit of fermenting warm under pressure, like the old method of the quick loggers that Brewlofsky used to recommend is basically you just do your growth phase cold and then you ramp up to warmer temperatures, right? To basically not promote like ester growth. And the reason why is to get through that phase, they say the diacetyl phase quicker. So maybe because you're also fermenting warm, right? Maybe you're going through that phase by decade without issue, right?
Yeah.
That could be it as well.
I think so. I see Marcelo nodding and giving the thumbs up. I think he's got, he probably has a better idea. Maybe Patrick does too with respect to that, right? But I think that would be the case.
I think so. You do the diacetyl rest because at the end of the fermentation, when you're fermenting, let's say at 12 Celsius, the yeast is already sick and tired. There is not much food left. People are falling apart and so on and so forth. They are lazy. Say, get me out of here. But if you're fermenting at 16 or 18 or whatever that might be, everybody's hungry. Get me out of the way. Where is the food? They just eat diacetyl, they eat whatever is in front of them. And that should be the thing. Yeah,
I think I really like this method for loggers. I don't know. I mean, it's just like I said, I keep saying like 2020 is the year of the logger for me, right? Because like I would never be doing this many loggers this way or this many loggers period. I would do like maybe one in the winter and then maybe one in the spring, so that as it turns into summer, I'd have something there, right? But with this pressure fermentation, and now after talking with Andrew and Patrick and Marcelo, I mean, I may want to start trying to see if I can do some ales this way and see what it's like, right?
You are going to be fully addicted to them.
You see, I don't want that to happen, right?
Because not because of the alcohol, but the process.
No. Yeah, the process. I know, right?
It's amazing. Just
right.
Amazing.
I know that I did start looking at things like, for example, like you were mentioning, Marcelo, the dry hopping, right? And trying and figuring a way to dry hop when you're doing the pressure fermentation. And I keep thinking about the IPA, for example, that Patrick had mentioned, that type of stuff, or I'd like to be able to do that. I don't know if Andrew, I don't know if you've ever done any dry hopping when you've done pressure, but
yeah, I dry hop in a separate keg though. I purge the keg, add the hops in, into a purged keg, and then I transfer into it, close transfer. So I avoid having to open the keg and the foaming issue and all that.
There's another option, right? Because there's always the ability to dry hop in the actual serving keg itself.
I then actually transfer to a serving keg. So I go through 3 kegs in the process of making some of my beers.
Whoa. Right.
So one of the things that I saw with the all-rounder when I was researching dry hopping with it is that a bunch of people were taking sealed magnets and putting their hops with either a magnet or a stir bar in a hop sock inside the fermenter, but keeping a magnet on the outside of the fermenter and above the liquid level, so that when they're ready to dry hop, they just pull the magnet off and it drops the bag of your hops directly into the wort at that point. So that was something to look at. To be quite honest, I really didn't think it was necessary. And again, obviously, I'm letting off the pressure before I toss the hops in. But with the all-rounder, it's a 30-liter fermenter, so I'm not overly concerned about excessive foam coming up at that point, because I'm tossing the hops in, I'm recapping it, and I repressurize it. I'll burp it once or twice as well, but no oxidation from an IPA standpoint.
I'm gonna send you some videos about that. You're gonna see what I'm talking about when it's for me.
Oh no, I believe you. I've seen enough videos of fermenters blowing off, but you know, as it is, I'm doing about 21, 22 liter batches.
I get it.
You know, so I've got a fair amount of headspace with it.
Yeah, that's the thing too. I remember like the discussion that was on the Facebook group today with respect to like I said, not leaving enough headspace. It can, depending on what you're fermenting in, it can be dangerous, right? And I know that a lot of us, I mean, I've seen, who was it who had, I think it was Emily, who had who had initially shown like a fermenter that had gone like, they didn't leave enough headspace, I think, and it was just like overflowing in the actual fermentation chamber, the fridge itself, right? But I've also heard of people having things like, well, heck, like I mean, last year's cask days, I was cleaning up beer from you know, from a cask that the bung had just went, right? So it can be dangerous, right? So it's about, you know, if there's enough headspace there and you have a blow off tube and all that sort of stuff, you should be okay. Just you got to be careful with it, especially if you're going to decide to fill up a glass fermenter, right? With you know, I've heard horror stories of people picking up glass fermenters and dropping them and, you know, having a gash. So
I post a link from one of them YouTube videos.
Yeah,
So do you think, I was going to say, do you think I should,
glass cardboard?
hit the stop button for the recording?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's about it, Eric. Yeah. I don't think I think we were just discussing.
Maybe just move it to informal now.
Yeah. So.
All right. Thanks, David.
That was a lot of fun. I enjoyed myself.